I harked back to 2017 when I first joined SportsPro, and our tagline was "Every deal, every day." And I think if we try to cover every deal every day now, it'd be a sort of 24-hour working day, because there's so many announcements, so many releases that land in the inbox.
I remember talking to Warren Barton about his hamstrings. What am I doing? Let me out of this hell. So there is a sort of reason why we're here, and there's interesting stuff in the business of sport.
Hello and welcome to Outlines, a podcast about sport, stories and the media. My name's Owen Connolly, hope you're well. It is great to have you listening. Right, 32 episodes into this series, and we're getting around to the bit of the sports media in which I've spent most of my own career to date. We're going to be talking this time about the sports industry media, about the value and the challenges and the peculiarities of telling stories to and about those who work in the business of sport. And I'm delighted to call upon a couple of longtime friends and colleagues who've got plenty to add through their perspective. Sam Carp is someone I was lucky enough to hire back in 2017 when I was the editor at SportsPro, a leading global media company for the sports industry. And not only is he still there, he is now himself the head of editorial and produces reliably excellent work across SportsPro's digital platforms, its podcasts, and its conferences. So that's all worked out pretty well, I think. Richard Gillis, meanwhile, brings his own distinctive take to the sector as the founder of Unofficial Partner, which delivers very popular podcasts as well as bespoke events and a weekly newsletter. He was previously the editor of Sport Business, another fine title in this space, while he's also had spells in the sports media mainstream with the likes of the Irish Times and worked in the sports industry itself with Havas. And we covered a lot of ground: the role of B2B sports media, who the audience is and where specialist insight can be added and applied, not least now that sports business coverage is so much more widespread. We talked about commercial factors, about the noise that builds around new trends, and much more. Very thoughtful contributions from both guests. Hopefully a useful window into that world if you're not familiar with it, and a point of reflection if you are. I should flag that the thing that prompted this conversation was SportsPro London, which has been SportsPro's flagship event since 2014 and pertinently has updated its positioning this year to focus on the reality of sport right now. The goal is to set aside predictions, speculation, and next big thing thinking in favour of honest discussions and practical solutions. It's at the Kia Oval, lovely spot, on the 29th and 30th of April. If you're in the industry and you want to find out more, head to london.sportspro.com. That link will be in the show notes. If you're enjoying the podcast, as ever, subscribe, rate, review, spread the word. Go to SportsPro London with a badge that says, "Ask me about Outlines, a podcast about sport, stories and the media." Might need a t-shirt for all that, actually. Social media details also in the show notes. But that's enough of that. We have got plenty to go over and two great people to go over it with. Here are Sam Carp and Richard Gillis. Probably the best thing to do because, we all know each other well and we all know the space well, and there will be people listening to this who do also, but there will be lots who are less familiar with kind of the vagaries of industry media. So it's probably good to just sort of set the terms. So let's just each of you talk a little bit about where you think your place is in this space. We have people here who aren't represented, the likes of Sport Business and Leaders and Sport Industry Group. And then, of course, international titles as well. And everyone plays a slightly different role in this ecosystem, but it's probably good to just kind of get a sense from each of you of which you do. Sam?
Yeah, I can go first. It's interesting because when you asked this, Owen, I harked back to 2017 when I first joined SportsPro, and our tagline was "Every deal, every day." And I think if we try to cover every deal every day now, it'd be a sort of 24-hour working day, because there's so many announcements, so many releases that land in the inbox, which perhaps speaks a little bit to how the industry has changed and how it's grown in that time. But I think, and well, the tagline that sits on the website now is where the sports industry goes next. But from a sort of editorial perspective, I've always I've viewed us as a resource that people turn to for authoritative, credible, hopefully informative reporting on the business of sport. So an element of that is keeping people up to date with what's happening, which is the news of the sports business. But increasingly, I think I see our role as going deeper into some of those developments that we're covering, explaining the why behind the what, outlining why some of these things actually matter and the implications that they have, whether it's, Paramount buying WBD or betting bans coming into place in the Premier League, for example. And I guess also, let's face it, we're also a bit of a platform for the industry as well. Kind of a B2B marketing platform as well. And then I guess we're also kind of a bit of a connector and educator in the sense that we have our events, we have our podcast, we have, everything that we kind of do. Hopefully it's helping people working in sport understand the industry a little bit better. Whenever they engage with our content, they come away feeling a little bit more informed, whether that's from reading one of our insights, engaging with some of the data or tools that we have in SportsPro Plus, or listening to one of our podcasts or attending our events. So that's kind of how I see it. We're kind of keeping people up to speed with things and also trying to educate a little bit at the same time as well.
Yeah, beautifully done, Sam. And also, so I think probably, as we'll come to in a sec, points to some of the changes in how people encounter this kind of media and through the course of their work and the kind of the role that it plays, or the role that it needs to play. Richard, you come from a slightly different background. You were at Sport Business, and then you briefly wrote a column for SportsPro. Or was it that brief? I don't know.
It was quite brief, actually. It was quite brief. It was both. They were both brief, and the period of writing it was quite brief. It was.
But you are now running Unofficial partner, I should point out.
I am running. I co-own.
Yeah.
In contractual terms, but So I used to write. I was editor of Sport Business. And this is a long time ago. So the sort of 2000, I think it was. And then I got a job there. I didn't know the sport business sort of existed really. And I was incredibly naive. And it then sort of, for 4 years, they gave me the job as editor after about, 6 months of being there. And that wasn't anything to do with me. It was to do with, no one else wanted to do it, frankly. And it was like a sort of, that period, I learned a load, and I then met a load of people who are now sort of grown-ups and have got proper jobs and are running things, and you sort of that does your head in a bit. So this is a long way of saying I'm older than you, but there's I sort of went away and then came back like a sort of returning hero in many ways. That's what people that's what people talk. That's on your list of talking points, which is one of my favourite phrases, is that what role does the outlet play, and it's sort of beating heart, conscience, that sort of, sexy.
I should point out at this moment
but relatable.
Richard sat up in the Unofficial partner studio cubby.
Cubby?
People who see the clip will notice this, but you are sitting in front of a big print that says sarcasm on it, which I think we may be people less exposed to some of your output. Maybe
need exposed to my output. Yeah, I'm always exposing my output at every turn. There's so to answer your question. So that was in the early 2000s, and the only reason I mention that is that I was sort of that was quite an insight into the way in which publishing in this bit of the jungle works. So it was fascinating and horrifying by turns, and then I grew up a lot, and I sort of got to understand, this is how it works, and this is the job now. I then went away and started working for other people. I worked for the FT and the Wall Street Journal and, various other places, the Observer, the Irish Times. And then I got a job on the other side, working for, an agency, a very big sort of advertising agency and marketing agency. And that was about, I think, this is how it works. It's quite interesting. You sort of get to see behind the scenes and see the sausage factory. So, and then in sort of 2019, we thought I then look back, having, how do I say it, exited gracefully or got the sack. One of those two. One of those. Both are true. Two things can be true at the same time. And I thought, well, actually, there is a space back in that old world, which I don't think was being filled at the time. So podcasts were the obvious place to jump into it. I quite liked doing them, and there wasn't much going on in that space. Our old mate Matt Cutler had his thing going. There was a couple of other, stuff in the space, but I thought, well, no, let's just jump in here, and that's where we began. And that was sort of, God knows, 7 years ago now. And the idea being that there is a sort of two voices, I've always thought, in the business, and it's probably true of all businesses, this, but when you go to a conference, you put a mic in front of someone and interview them, or the way in which they're portrayed in media, there's the bullshit end, people talking in LinkedIn type language, and then there's the language in the bar, and when you go to an event and you talk to people afterwards. That second one was the bit that I wanted to capture. And that was the aim, because actually that second one was really funny. It was really cynical. It was really interesting. It was real. And I'm not going to use the word authentic, although I've just said it. It had that sense of what's actually happening. I thought podcasts were a good format to try and capture that. You're never going to get it entirely, but that was the ambition. So there was a sort of private eye-ish positioning meets, I don't know what else, but there's a sort of, I always felt that the stuff that I was doing at Sport Business 25 years ago was a sort of weird tone of voice for actually the reality of it. And I think that distance still remains, but podcasts have done a job in trying to sort of capture what I think is actually the real voice. And it's the stuff that people are interested in, and they gossip, and they're, who's lost their job, why have they just hired that person? All of that sort of stuff is just the day to day, isn't it? And it's trying to sort of capture a bit of that, as well as, to Sam's point, what I quite like about what we're doing is that I'm not a paper of record. We don't have to cover every deal every day. That became, when I was at Sport Business, became a sort of a bit of a burden, because actually you're just sort of just on this hamster wheel the whole time, trying to keep up with events. It's obviously much different now than it was then. It was much simpler back then. But yeah, that's so Unofficial Partner has sort of emerged from that basic idea.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that I think will probably be a bit of a kind of prevailing theme here is, in that time, even in the time, Sam, since we're in the very unusual position of you being on my podcast and me having hired you back in 2017, but
I was wondering how long it would take for you to bring that up.
It's in the intro, don't worry. But even in that time, those kind of, where are we, 8 years, 9 years, it's changed quite a bit, because of both the kind of internal kind of incentives that drive industry media, and we'll talk about this a bit, but more towards community and events and things like that. But also the scale of coverage outside of the specialist part of the industry, whether it's coming from, the Athletic or the FT or whoever else, kind of means that you're focusing more on specialism in a different way. You're not just like, well, no one else is going to cover, this paint company becoming a third-tier sponsor of this football club. It's more that you have to, I guess, get inside the mind of your audience a little bit more and think, well, how does this make them do their job better? Or how is this, rather than talking about the industry in the abstract. Let's talk a bit about that audience. Who do you consider to be in your audience, or who are you thinking of when you're kind of making editorial plans and all the rest of it?
Yeah, I don't think it's actually changed that significantly over the 10 years in terms of who the audience is. And for the most part, I still think of it as people who work in sport. That's the part that I don't think has changed. I guess like the makeup of that has changed a little bit. Obviously, the agencies that have always been there are still there, rights holders and federations, broadcasters, etc. But then you kind of have this whole, what I guess has changed over the past, 9 years that I've been working in the space, is that you have kind of different subsections of those now. So obviously the broadcasters, you've got the streamers within that, you've got all of these technology providers now as well who are part of that ecosystem, investors increasingly as well now, I think, especially over the last few years part of that audience. And I think also what's been interesting, and maybe this is just thinking about how the numbers have changed over the years as well. I think people who don't work in but have an interest in the business of sport have become part of the audience as well. Perhaps not a core part of the audience, and they're not necessarily the ones that we're looking to capture quite as much. I mean, there's maybe a period between pre-COVID and perhaps during, when we were looking to appeal to that audience a little bit more. But and I think we'll maybe come on to that in a little bit. But that's definitely been part of it as well. But yeah, I just think in terms of how it's changed, it's grown in the sense that some of those core people are still there, but there are just different subsections of it now. And I think that's been like the main difference that I've seen.
Yeah, and I guess that's a reflection of how the industry's changed, because it was quite a repeatable pattern across a lot of how different sports businesses worked. A lot of stuff got outsourced through sport was a B2B business, basically, primarily because they'd sell media rights and they'd sell sponsorship. And so on the inside, it was quite small. And now that increasingly is changing. You're having people who, as you say, are either coming in from adjacent industries or like serving different functions within the sports industry. They might be more interested in creative or cultural stuff, or they might have, more of a kind of a direct into fans kind of sales role or whatever. But yeah, it's interesting, the thing about people who don't necessarily work in the space, and that can be, I suppose, informed fans, but it could also be in much the same way, Sam, as you might read The Drum or something. People who are looking at this space and thinking,
who reads The Drum?
Industry stuff about other industries to kind of give yourself a different perspective on sport. You might also get people who are thinking, well, how does sport work, and what might that mean for different forms of media or different, cultural space. I
think, like, anecdotally as well, maybe I shouldn't say this, but when I first joined SportsPro, a lot of my friends didn't really know what a SportsPro was, where that sort of sat and what sort of publication it was. And to Richard's point about when you join sport business, Richard, I kind of had a similar thing when I joined SportsPro. To be honest, it was kind of a first job out of uni thing. Really knew I wanted to work in sport, knew I wanted to write about sport, preferably, and this was kind of where I ended up. And that's when you kind of start to learn a little bit more about the industry as well. But to your point, yeah, and just I think now the change has been I get people sort of like mentioning that they've been sent articles from SportsPro, even from a sport business or from a Sportico or whoever in a WhatsApp chat now, because there is that kind of like general interest, and it is starting to spread a little bit further than it was maybe sort of like 10 years ago. And I think people are taking a greater interest in the space, which I think is why, again, to go back to your talking point, Owen, that why we're sort of seeing the mainstream media pick it up a little bit more, because the audience is there for it and people are actually interested in this kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, always fun in a news or doc or YouTube video or something to see the SportsPro headline clipped up. Richard, what about Unofficial Partner? I feel like your audience is maybe a little more self-selecting. I don't know. Is it a portion of that sports business, or do you also think you've got that slight overlap of earwiggers and people who are just curious to understand a little bit more how this all works?
I think so. Who is the listener? I think there's a real, Sam mentioned there about you've got this sort of inner circle and then the outer circle. And I've always thought the outer circle were sort of alluring, like a siren call, the sort of, you get to a sort of B to B to C position where we've occasionally dipped into that, and you get something that, like last month we talked to the Ryan Norris, who runs Spurs commercial, chief revenue officer, or we did something on Man City's, the 115 thing. That then gets caught onto football Twitter, football sort of sites around and podcasts, and you get invited onto various Talk Sport and various places like that. All of which is fine, but there's no money in that for us, because we don't care about that, because we are very, very tight to B2B. So because I think as the thing has blown up, and you're right, it has gone from a sort of very small cottage niche trade space into something bigger, and we can argue why that's happened and whatever, but just obviously just got bigger. And I think the challenge is keeping to the people that you're really servicing. And I think one of the interesting questions I always ask sort of journalists, or who is it you're writing for? You know, who are you talking to when you talk into the microphone? Unless you've got a very, very sharp idea of who that is and you know them very, very well, then everything will start to slide. And that's the problem when you start to chase big numbers. And, you know, we're in this world where the numbers are just idiotic. So the first question or anyone ever asks if you've got a podcast is how many people listen. And we can tell them very honestly what it is, or we can lie, depending on who we're talking to. But it's always, you know, they want a big number, but actually they want 20 people or 50 people to listen, you know, who are proper targets of theirs. So when you get into a sort of commercial sponsorship conversation. So it's nuanced. And I think there's a race on, I see lots of new things appearing, which are obviously sort of, I think, a caught in the middle. And that's where you don't want to be. So you're either going to be goal hanger or you're going to be, you know, massive podcasters, television type product where you're going to, you know, they're chasing ITV ad money. It's a big, big game and it's a big race. And there's going to be a very few number of winners at the top. I go the other way. I think actually down is where we want to go. We want to go into, you know, we do golf, business of golf. We're doing business of horse racing soon. We're doing business of, you know, looking at rugby, looking at cricket, looking at smaller and smaller themes, because I think actually there's probably there's fewer people there, but they are of higher value. So just to answer your question, there is a sort of game there and you need to be careful about jumping from one to the other. The other bit is, again, back to the numbers. It's so easy to fiddle numbers, you know, it's just ridiculous. There's obviously a cottage industry in sport fiddling numbers. So it's you know, you could pipe it, you know, we sometimes sort of people in bank queues, people at Feltham Young Offenders. It's like, you know, just put the podcast on, send it over the wall and you can claim all those numbers. You know, it's such a silly situation that we're in where you've got bots chasing bots and whatever. So podcasts and the sort of Substack question is really interesting because actually most of the time these are real people, which is quite refreshing. So it's sort of that bit, and there's a, you know, it's a microcosm of the sports question about, you know, lying about audiences, lying about, you know, who's following, digital followers, the global fan, all of these questions that we run into all the time. You get back to actually who is at the other end, and do you know who they are, really know who they are, and can you provide something of value to them? That's basically what we're all trying to do. And the rest is just bullshit, because the rest is just, what number do you want to hear? And we'll tell you, because we can go and find it. But that's never the game that we've played. So I think it's really interesting. When you look at, so again, Substack, LinkedIn, now that's, you know, those are sort of become significant channels for the stuff that we do. There's obviously you're sort of bombarded with AI bullshit, but that is a sort of area where at the beginning, so in 2019, we've added almost one listener at a time, you know, one newsletter subscriber at a time, and they sign up and you know who they are. Substack is different. Substack is a much more sort of mercurial thing. You get it sort of goes up, but it's going up and down like a sort of, you know, I don't know what a wavy thing would be, but that's quite interesting, because actually that's telling you that people aren't that bothered. You know, they take it or leave it, and they're not people that we want. But we've been talking to the same people for quite a long time. So as has Sam, as have you, you know. So you have a core audience, and I think you've got to be honest about that. And then, you know, the rest of it is just an advertising conversation, which becomes, you know, well, becomes an advertising conversation.
Yeah. Just on that, there are shows that you will do, and Sam, there's stuff that SportsPro does that's got a commercial component to it, and we'll get onto that and kind of making that a bit more usable and interesting and all the rest of it. But beyond that, for you in particular, Richard, where you're working independently, you know, there have been people who've come on this podcast who've said, oh, you have to think forensically about the audience, and that's kind of an old kind of media way of looking at things. And then there have been people particularly who are in sort of newer forms of media or working in smaller teams who will say, I follow what I find interesting, and I think my audience is people who also find this interesting. Like, where do you fall on that spectrum? Because it's going to be different from Sam, because Sam's an organisation
So
that's got
I am
X number of people in the team.
I am liberated from having to follow the data in a way that makes things boring. So if I want to do something, I'll do something. If I want to write a story, I'll write a story. I don't care who, finds it annoying or whatever. I just want to be as honest as I can. And you're sort of trying to weigh up. If you follow what's popular, I would, back to your previous point, I would just do a chief revenue officer of a Premier League football club every week. And, you would get a big number because you would get that sort of outer ring on a regular basis. Now, back to the commercial question. So people who advertise with us, our argument in the space of, that we're in the arena that we're playing in our little bit, is that actually you want to focus on clients who is actually going to buy. So Sidley Sport launched last year. They've been a sponsor of the podcast over the last year. We're in awards season. They've just won 2 sort of Agency of the Year awards. Their feedback was that 90% of people who have heard of Sidley Sport, it came from Unofficial partner. Because we're showing up each week, we can sort of build a really interesting advertising medium that sits between SportsPro London, Leaders, Sport Business, trade shows and magazines, all of that stuff, Sportel. So it's finding that bit has been really quite useful, because actually that means that we're always on effectively, and that you're turning the podcast into social stuff, and you can always take the client, the advertising client, with them. So that's been useful, and it's there's a sort of upside and downside to being small. There's loads of times where I think, I really wish I'd have Sam's sort of fleet of people that I really want to get into this subject. I want to do this, or I want to do something on TikTok, or I want to do that. There's so many things you want to do, but you just haven't got capacity or bandwidth to do. That's the downside of being small. But the upside is complete liberty to do whatever you want and not do stuff that you don't want to do. Yeah.
Sam, Richard mentioned SportsPro London there. SportsPro London, not SportsPro Live, is a distinction.
Is there a rebrand happening as we speak?
Well, no, the rebrand has happened. You successfully picked up on it, but I'm going to have to keep reminding myself. But that's not that's not.
It is still live though, technically, isn't it? So it's like it's live in London.
But the name change is not the significant bit, and not the bit that really inspired this conversation. What I picked up on, and I had a chat with your colleague Mike Long, and was the shift in emphasis of that event. So for the benefit of people who aren't in the industry, SportsPro London is kind of the flagship event for SportsPro. It's a spin-up of the original. SportsPro now does events all over the world and on different themes, but this was the single move into that space about 12 years ago. And the shift that you've done thematically there is, it's gone from being a very future-focused, like tech, all that kind of innovation stuff, to the reality of sport right now is the tagline for 2026. I mean, what does that mean on its face? But also, what was behind that that change in framing?
A big one. I think it almost goes back a little bit to what Richard was talking about at the start, when he talks about the fact that you have that kind of LinkedIn pocket of the industry now. You have the people behind the mic at some of these events, and some of the stuff that they're saying is kind of, it's all painting a very rosy picture, and sort of patting themselves on the back and that kind of stuff, and everything's great, everything's trending in the right direction. Whereas I think the reality of sport right now, if you speak to a lot of people working within it, is that that's not necessarily the case. And I think, there's obviously standout examples. There's organizations like the Premier League, you've got your NFL as your NBAs, where things are always going in the right direction. It's always good to hear from them on stage. But obviously outside of that, you have everybody else, this squeeze middle that everyone talks about. And even some of these top leagues, you just look at Liga.
Very good podcast series, that Squeeze Middle,
yeah.
by the way.
Yeah, unintentional. But yeah, Liga and even Belgian Pro League more recently with DAZN, rugby in this country, for example, who aren't seeing that same level of growth, whether it's on the media rights side, whether it's on the sponsorship side as well, where brands are increasingly sophisticated about how they measure ROI, and so there's more kind of pressure to demonstrate that. So I think the sort of shift in the event is kind of a response to that, and people wanting to come to these conferences and go away with actual actionable insights. Because let's face it, a tier 2 or tier 3 organization that probably does make up a lot of that conference audience isn't going to be able to do a lot of the things that a Premier League is doing or that an NFL is doing. They're not going to have the kind of resource to do that sort of stuff. So yeah, there's a kind of shift towards what the reality in sport is today and how certain organisations are reacting to it. So there's still going to be some of those panel sessions. There is admittedly still some of that there. So we've got Marina Storsey from WTA Ventures talking about their new Premier partnership with Samsung. Simon Massey-Taylor from Prem Rugby will be on stage. Peter Kenyon with his Williams Racing cap on this time. Dominic Thiem, I think, was confirmed this week as well. But then there's
will it actually be a cap, or is it just a metaphorical cap?
TVC potentially. Hopefully, hopefully he comes with a load of caps to hand out to attendees. I think that would be beneficial. But yeah, then there's also going to be case studies happening. So whether it's kind of about how certain brands entertain sponsorship pitches, whether it's about how a property has repackaged its rights to take its sponsorship rights to market, whether it's how certain organizations have adopted certain technologies and the positive sort of business impacts that's having, those are going to be there as well. So there's going to be kind of hopefully more like kind of more raw conversation around the state of the industry right now, and some actual actionable sessions around what people can do to kind of navigate this difficult time in the industry.
Yeah, because there's two things going on, right? There's the shorter term, hopefully, stuff, or the kind of external stuff. Energy bills going up again probably this year, interest rates not coming down. So you've got, things being more expensive to run, businesses being more expensive to run, money being harder to come by, etc. And that affecting people at the fan level and then also the organizational level. But then you've got the structural stuff, so which maybe doesn't affect the Premier League and the NFL in the same way, because if there's a slowing media rights market, the NFL and the Premier League are hoovering up a lot of the money that's in that market before it filters down to everybody else. Everyone else has to kind of work out how they keep going in the longer term.
Do you not think though? I find this bit of the conversation really interesting, and I think it's really odd when this talks to a sort of inside outside bit in terms of people from outside of sport would be amazed how sort of miserable people are about the state of the sports industry. Do you know what I mean? And I'm part of that. I'm part of that game. It's easier to sort of to write that sort of story, but there's a sort of it's a weird one because things have never been as good in many ways. And there's you've got this sort of huge amounts of money pointing at sport, wanting to buy things and invest in things and whatever. You've got this bundle conversation, which has been going on since, God knows how long. And you're right in terms of I get the framing that what do we do with people who, the money might not come in the same amounts. But I find there's an incredible lack of jeopardy to this story in terms of I don't really care if the money slows down. Do you know what I mean? It's a really weird sort of situation because actually what would happen? What's going to happen? And most people who, again, when you're sort of talking to people who are, the muggles outside of the sports industry, who don't, who just follow their team and watch cricket, golf, tennis, whatever, they just see amounts of money flying at athletes and stars. And I know it's more complex than that, but actually, so they have to take a pay cut, or something means that, heaven forbid, county cricket or state cricket in Australia goes back to being a sort of 6 month a year job. There's a really difficult question to be had, because actually just the amount of inflation and the assumption, the sense of entitlement that is within sport, that there's going to be a massive amount of money flowing in, and there still is, and it still is growing up. But we're sort of pegged to this perfect storm scenario, which has been painted, that I think it's really questionable, because actually, of course, there's going to be people, organizations who suffer. There's going to be people in the middle, particularly where things are, they're going to have to change. They're going to be worried. They were always marginal in the bundle. I always bought the Sky bundle for Premier League and golf, but it came with, Speedway from Gdansk. I was never going to pay for it. I never watched it. And, why should I feel guilty about, okay, that's going to happen to that bit of the market? I know that's a bit punchy, but I do think there's a sort of overall, I just don't feel the fear that is pervasive in the sports business conversation. And, a lot of people, I think it's quite easy to just paint a really negative picture.
Well, I suppose the positive framing would be there is more attention than ever, and that is going to equate to something. And there are, the thing I hear quite a lot is if you have less at stake financially, if you're not already receiving or haven't been receiving for kind of 20 years these big rights fees, then you can approach it all in another way, and eventually you'll turn that interest, that following into other.
There's a lot of people in the middle who are selling solutions to this, and obviously D2C is one of them. Own your audience. All of these things that you hear day in, day out is part of, an answer. And it's you're hearing it with AI now. And, if you're selling something, you're pushing a particular narrative. And there is the conversations that we often have are driven by that need to make money from the plumbers in the middle. And it's the plumbers who are the sports industry and the sports business. They're the sort of agencies, consultancies, professional services, sales, the contractors in the middle between the events and the rights holders and the fans. And one of your questions is, do we let fans in? One of the people we talk about in abstract at these events is our fans, but they're just sort of referenced in passing. But actually the industry in the middle is saying, okay, no, this is wrong and I've got a solution for it. And that's driving, frankly, the economy that we're all benefiting from. So it's quite interesting when you see the juxtaposition of the conversation, but also the sense of, no one's looking at the World Cup this summer and saying, oh, they need more money at that, this is going to be a real shit show.
Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I get it, and I think, but I do still think that does apply more. Obviously, no one's looking at the World Cup and thinking it needs more money, but if you're looking outside of that, I think there's probably an argument that there are other sports that are struggling for that kind of thing. So I guess just going back to the event as well, and if you're sort of, I think the important thing about the event as well is not just going to be focusing on those organisations that are right at the top. I think if you can sort of get some of those sort of tier 2s or tier 3s in there that have done something different, you can get them on stage to talk about that kind of thing. There might be some actionable things that people can take away from that. So yeah, I definitely sort of follow that line of thought. And if suddenly athletes who are being paid 6 figures a week have to get paid a little bit less, that's not perhaps not the end of the world to your average punter. But I guess for the sports themselves, it's a challenge, right? That if those things start to trend in the wrong direction, their attractiveness and both the sort of like people taking up the sport, and then also from a kind of like business perspective as well, there's that side of things to think of as well. So it's about keeping it all sort of like flowing and keeping it moving.
I think there's and it's a sort of nuanced argument, because again, we've just come off the Winter Olympics, and it was that there is, what is the aim? What's the point? You start to say, well, what is the point of curling? Everyone is a curling sort of expert for 2 weeks every 4 years, and we all, but then the participation legacy of that is minuscule, despite, whatever the people who run curling will say. So the question is, why? What's the value of the entertainment product that is driving the rights valuations? And the story of, okay, it's inspiring nations, children to, no one is arguing against that, in which case put a load of money. One of the questions, I think interesting questions is what we've done with the lottery money over the last, we're coming up for an anniversary. I don't want to give away my future podcast, but, one of the questions for everyone in British sport is, well, did we spend the, whatever it is, billions wisely? And could we have done it differently? And should the money have gone into high performance and chasing gold medals, or should it have gone elsewhere? That's a perennial debate, and it's nuanced, and it's not it's not a binary conversation. But when you get to TGL, live golf, track and field sort of things, new ways for rugby, whatever, what is the point of them? And when you start to then say, actually, the point is to make a return for your shareholders, you're owned by private equity and you better make a return because otherwise, everything will finish. That's a different argument than people will stop playing rugby or people will stop playing netball if the whole thing starts to collapse. And that's, it's sort of, you get to that quite quickly. And obviously it's about the business of sport. But I do sometimes think, I wonder why people are, what would happen? And it's easy for me to say, and there's lots of people in the middle of the, who are listening saying, sod off, my job will go, But it's quite it's a really difficult one to get exercised about sometimes. Don't know.
But I suppose it's gone from being stories that were kind of parallel straight lines, lots of organizations following the same model to various degrees of success and scale. And now it's not. Now it's going to be something really different for lots of different companies. And I guess that's why it's an interesting conversation. And, even down to the point that you were making about talent, that's always been part of the model, is we want to maximize the amount we can spend on the people actually performing. And that's why football is still having to, turn itself inside out to find new ways to add 2 games to every competition every year, because they've got to kind of keep this cycle of growth going, because there's no control on the cost of talent and what have you. But yeah, it's an interesting conversation, and
they just flow off. They just flow off me. Interesting conversations. They're just, it's what I do, is who I am.
Yeah, sarcasm. What it kind of takes us to, I guess, Sam, is the role that the sports industry media has in facilitating some of these discussions, because structurally, there are commercial levers, there are, as Richard says, there are companies who are selling solutions, and quite often when you get an opportunity to talk to someone, it's either someone who's selling that solution or it's someone who is projecting kind of success. We've had a good year, or we think we're going to have a good year, so we'll put this senior person up to have a chat with Sam Carp. And, there's also a tendency for it to become a place where noise can build up really easily around new technologies and, things that are fun and novel to talk about, and you can project way into the future, or you can say this is just a daft fad or whatever. But what do you think structurally about how industry media is set up to kind of conduct some of these debates?
Around the kind of new fad stuff specifically?
Around both. I mean, I in my notes, which you guys keep referring to, which is going to...
Meticulous was a phrase I used.
But, I talked about the noise and the susceptibility that may be there to amplify some of the noise around new things and whatever
the question is it
bag of money is delivering.
Yeah, the question is the media cheerleader or is it journalism, isn't it? That's the question.
A little bit, but also a little bit like how, easy is it to really lean into some of the stuff that's going to be happening at SportsPro London on a consistent basis when, the incentives that people have to talk are not necessarily about, here are some of the challenges that exist at the moment.
I think it can be trickier in the trade media, or I've certainly found it, partly because of some of those sort of commercial relationships and things that you speak about as well, and just sort of thinking about the type of media that we are. And when you talk about new shiny things that appear and hype trains and whatnot, like two things that immediately sprung to mind were two stories that I'd actually covered. One of them was Otro. Don't know if the two of you remember Otro.
I worked for Otro.
Richard remembers Otro.
I do. Yeah.
I was when I was in my sojourn, as I call it, for Havas, Otro became a client for a very short period of time. It was a fascinating case study.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, short period of time
reasons.
Probably sums it up. But like that was one, right? That was kind of, and when you talk about numbers, I remember doing that story and the numbers, given that the people involved with, I think Messi, Beckham, Zidane, Neymar, Suarez, all of those kinds of the numbers were crazy. And it was one of those things. I was quite early in the role, and it was like, you went and listened to what the CEO had to say, and you covered it, and you kind of took his word for it a little bit. And 3 months later, you looked back on that story and like, oh God, I probably should have maybe poked a few more holes in that business model and that idea, and that kind of thing. And then sort of a few years later, the next one that came up and that sprung to mind during this was Socios, which obviously emerged during, I think it was during COVID, obviously when the crypto category was booming, but then also fan tokens, getting people to vote on things like the color of the team bus, what music they warm up to, that kind of thing. And I remember speaking to the CEO there as well. And you do press and you do probe and you try to uncover these things. So I think there's an element of, I think people are, when there are these kind of like new things, people are interested in it and people are exploring them as well. And people within the industry are looking at them as potential new business opportunities. And I think you have a responsibility to cover it, but you have to cover it and look at it in a way that's, a slightly more cynical lens, I suppose. And then also similarly, that also applies to what you were talking about before, Owen, in terms of, someone's had a really good year and they want to put someone up to talk about it. It's kind of moving beyond those headline numbers and digging into what the actual story is within that. And that's kind of how I look at it. I think I think when you get those opportunities, you have to think about it as, yes, here's the reason this person's been put forward, but what can I unpick behind that that's actually going to make a more interesting story for my audience? Yeah.
I agree with that. And then there's a sort of balance, the obvious balance. I mean, we did a Web3 conference at the Emirates with Arsenal at the time. So that was the absolute peak of sort of NFT mania. And as a publisher, you think, okay, well, we've got to make a living somehow. And, we've got to take advantage of these. We did an AI conference. AI is a really interesting one. That's where we are at the moment. I agree with Otro, Socio, all of these sort of brands that come and go, they're fun stories to cover because they're just, there's someone somewhere has taken a massive bet, piled loads of money into it, and you better believe that they're going to try and push a comms line that, this is the future. So, and it's happening now, it's happening all the time. So part of what we're doing is, when it reaches sport, quite often these things are sort of, from outside sport and they just have an application in sport. But you don't have to go too far, I don't think, to actually sort of present a more skeptical sort of lens. I remember going to a Microsoft event, a launch event, in London. This is in sort of the noughties. And it was weird because the journalists were cheering, So the journalists were sort of applauded, cheering. And the nature of journalism in tech, is my point, is that they are sort of just the old, they're fans with laptops. But they're much more than that. They are just built into the system. And the assumption of Silicon Valley is that, that's why they hate the media, because they don't want to be questioned. They see it purely as a cheerleading marketing function. And that's how things have been. And that's why we are where we are, frankly. And, you can start to see that sort of attitude has spread across lots of different sectors. And occasionally you bump into it in our little bit of the world, but you don't need to do too much to actually start to say, yeah, but, and it's an interesting, because when you see a gravy train heading your way, you'd be a bloody idiot not to jump on it for a bit, and so there's a sort of, where do we take advantage of this the absurdity and where do we question it? And I think that's
Yeah.
that balance. It's not a binary thing. And if we were honest, we have to say, right, okay, there's a lot of people want to spend money in AI at the moment. So how are we going to facilitate that? Some of it is going to be nonsense, but I do think there's going to be real change as well. And we need to cover it in an interesting way. So there's a sort of element of it that's, people go back to the sort of Paxman interview style of, why are these lying bastards lying to me? And, asking the same question 15 times. And actually podcasts are a good medium for having a conversation. It's quite hard to come on a podcast and bullshit your way through PR lines for an hour, because you just you have to be a complete freak to be able to do that. So most people, you can get to some approximation of a different sort of take or a different story. And you can sort of nudge them off their comms lines and their talking points.
Yeah.
So I think, it's a sort of game, isn't it? And that part of the game is making money, publishing. And then there's also trying to get to something approximating what might sound true. I'm not going to start pontificating about, search for truth, etc. But part of the entertainment is trying to get someone to sort of admit that what they're selling is not exactly what they're saying.
Yeah. I mean, there's another thing. There's a principle in the tech business. I can't remember whose law it is, but I think I may even have cribbed it from one of your newsletters, Richard.
I would have thought so. You steal quite a lot from there. So I can't, I don't know why this would be any different. People overestimate the impact of technology in the short term and underestimate the impact in the long term. And I think that can be true as well for some of the commercial trends you see in sport. And in sport, of course, you have the other thing, which is that commercial teams are incentivized in the very, very short term. They need to get somebody in for the next season, and they have a big kind of song and dance to be able to make about something, particularly in some of these kind of fast emerging sectors. That last point is really is sort of very underestimated in terms of the impact, the individual impact. So when you're talking to individual people, sometimes they come on a podcast like mine because they want to get another job, and they want to get in the shop window, and they're talking about their business, but actually they're selling them. They want to sell themselves. So that's where you can get a bit of distance between the product and the person. And I think you sort of, you're always alert to what's actually happening. Why has this high profile person suddenly become available to come on a podcast? Now, it might be that they've got a new story to tell, a new deal has happened or whatever. It is sometimes that they're looking at the exit door, or they want to start to tell a different story. So, again, all of it's fine, but you're just aware of that.
Yeah. But just on that thing of the kind of, long-term, short-term thing, one of the products I think about is Golf TV, which was created to pretty considerable fanfare, quite a lot of money behind it. And some of the insights that were driving it around how people organize their time around their followership of some, particularly a lifestyle sport like golf, was very, very interesting. And so for me, as someone covering it, I was like, this is a really interesting approach. But of course, getting that to match up to the huge numbers that are involved in media rights fees and getting that to turn into a kind of another subscription that people will pay every month is a very different story. And those are some of the other things, I suppose, that, when you're talking about ideas and trends and stuff, can complicate things.
Well, I mean, and again, something you probably steal from my newsletters, but I quite often talk about expensive stories, so there are, and this is particularly true when you're talking to sort of the investment class, this whole tribe of people from, in terms of the finance bit, what they're betting on, and it is a bet, is, okay, we're going to invest in this, in stories that end up costing a lot of money. And, it's always difficult in the middle of it to work out. It's easy to look back and say, yeah, that was a crap decision because of, whatever, it didn't work out. But that's the game they're playing. They're doing it in real time. So that's that sort of, Gen Z's viewing behavior, the global fan. We're about to come through, over the next 6 months, we'll all be talking about NBA Europe, trying to sort of get franchises away based on a fandom for basketball in Europe. which someone somewhere has got a deck saying is under leveraged, and it might be, but I ain't going to pay 700 million for a franchise, to come to London and Rome and Paris to try and establish that fact. So good luck to whoever is going to have a go at that. But anyone you talk to is saying, okay, they're, to Sam's point, there are questions, but let's just put it there. There are some questions to be asked.
Yeah. Sam putting a big black line through your name on a list of possible NBA Europe investors there, Richard. But
so sure, that's your headline.
Yeah. There's a few. One thing that I was keen to get to was this idea of the voices that are missing from the conversation, and particularly fan voices. I was struck, Richard, because fans won't necessarily, they might see an angle that the kind of person who's got their industry head on will miss. I saw something, and I hate to introduce Tottenham Hotspur to the conversation, but a Spurs fan on, or kind of Spurs fan creator on one of these YouTube shows was talking about the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium.
Yeah.
And
it was a woman, wasn't it? It was on the overlap, was it, or one of those?
No, this is a different clip, but I know the one you're talking about. But the thing he was introducing was, they have an NFL stadium basically.
Yeah.
And they are positioning themselves as the prime candidate if the NFL does ever decide to move a team to London to host that franchise.
Yeah.
So, all the underinvestment in the team that's kind of this sort of odd managed, Hemingway style, gradually and all at once collapse of Tottenham Hotspur as a Premier League.
You're forgetting
force.
There's a state of the art go-kart track under there as well.
There is. They're looking at a picture there that maybe some people are not putting together because they're thinking, oh, Tottenham have been quite savvy here in creating these kind of ancillary revenue streams. But this fan is thinking, I want them to build a football team that can win a game at home.
But I think those are two different things.
That's not a priority.
I think so. Your basic question is: do we need more fan voices in the space? I think the answer would be yes, until you meet a fan, and then you say, right, actually, it's like Churchill meeting voters. I think it's sort of, unless something is really badly wrong with the agency sector, then the fan sentiment should be being presented. And I agree that it's nice to have it punctured. It's nice to have someone to say, I always say, what you take a Spurs fan and then sit them down at, Leaders or SportsPro Live SportsPro London, and what they would make of it. And there is sort of high comedy to be had there. But the other bit is actually, I don't know if you've ever been on a football fan podcast, but I mean, I did one last month, and it wasn't a very happy experience. They're just moaning, and they're just really, and
I mean,
also
it was a Tottenham podcast.
It's very negative.
So I'm not that surprised it was an unhappy experience.
It's obviously going to be negative, but it was really boring. And I used to do a bit of, when I used to do sports journalism, pure, bits of. I remember being a football reporter of The Observer, for a season, and it was like, this is really fucking boring. I remember talking to Warren Barton about his hamstrings. I think, fucking hell, what am I doing? Let me out of this hell. So there is a sort of reason why we're here, and I think there's interesting stuff in the in the business of sport. Of course, it's all about the fan, as Giles Morgan will tell you, whilst sort of looking down at them from the hospitality tent. Or the hospitality box. You can't really look down on someone from a town. I don't know. I mean, I've only been to Spurs hospitality. I don't think they've got tents up there. That'd be quite interesting. Quite nice innovation.
So I was going to jump in.
Please do jump in, Sam.
I think the interesting thing as well is when you pose this question is kind of to what end, to what end is getting a fan more involved in kind of SportsPro's output. What does that kind of serve? How is the industry going to react to that? Is sort of having this Crystal Palace fan cry foul about missing out on the Europa League this season because of UEFA's multi-club ownership rules going to have a tangible impact on what UEFA does moving forward? I'm not so sure. We've kind of incorporated it before in the way that you maybe speak to sort of supporters groups, for example, around specific things, and that's kind of the way you get that fan perspective, perhaps in a little bit more nuanced way than you would maybe through some of the others. I think as well, like, I don't know, I still spend far too much time on X, and as we're talking about, we've been talking about the way that there's just become more general interest in the sports business itself. Like, it feels like now every other person on X is a financial accountant or an expert in that space, which is, I think, part of why there's become that level of interest, and sort of introducing that into kind of the SportsPro output just doesn't feel comfortable yet.
Well, it's quite interesting. You're both the probably the best iteration of the sort of that the GAT is the most marketable list, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that it's sort of interesting when you see when that goes out, that does break into the sort of broader ring, and it does that job. And I always think it's a really, really nice bit of marketing for the platform. And I think there's a space for that. But I'm always interested in how it goes down, what people. So when you see these things again go into TalkSport or Radio 5 Live, or there's something weird happens because it sort of has to get dumbed down to an extent. And this is true of all like business type stories generally, and the economics type stories, because they get filtered through. One of the frustrations I had of writing stuff for newspapers was that it was just such an idiotic process of, you remember the Dubai crisis of 2000, the financial crisis, and people, that you'd have sports editors ring up and say, can you write a piece about, Arsenal's transfer budget because, we're worried about the Emirates. I said, fuck me, that's, really? Is this what this is about? So it's that sort of filtering. And this is why the niche that we're in is valuable, because actually there is a demand for stuff that just is more interesting or more accurate or devotes more time to smaller subjects, which Radio 4, Radio 5, the Times, the Observer, they can't do that. Even like the Economist and the Financial Times, they are fighting. Sport is fighting for space against energy and war and politics and all the rest of it in a way that we aren't. So that's the reason that the sports business niche exists and thrives.
I suppose it comes down to how do you address any possible gaps in the conversation, because there isn't a singular fan anyway. There's going to be the fan who's bothered that their ticket price has gone up or that their club is not spending enough, but there's also going to be the fan that has a slightly more kind of broad-based
I'll stop talking, but there is one of the interesting, I think really interesting bits is the distance between, and it's most obvious in football, like England fans and the FA, and there again, it's like sort of Churchill and voters. You see it in Labour Party hierarchy hates Labour, hates the voters, but there's a sort of really difficult relationship there with football owners and their fans. They want to monetize them. They want to turn them into, lifetime value and all of these things that we talk about ad nauseum. And that's where I think the sort of clash really is. So when you get people talking about the business of business of Spurs when they're about to go down, people are properly angry and they will focus on the business, So one of the running themes is business is bad. That's a theme of you start a story. If you're writing for a newspaper, they're bastards, they're up to something, the bastard bankers, and business is a bad thing, At the same time, all the fans are working for businesses and they're all, that's their livelihood. So there's a really odd juxtaposition, and they don't want to have the conversation about how business applies to sport, because by definition, you're going to get to areas that they feel sort of they hate and goes against their sort of self-image, whilst drinking beer and sitting in a £1 billion stadium.
There are elements, particularly now, Sam, as people get a bit better informed, or as people have become kind of more informed, and the commercial conversations have been centralised a bit. But when clubs are doing things well, lots of fans are cognizant of it. The meme is kind of all the Arsenal merch of the last kind of 5 years, but Liverpool and other clubs have done quite a good job of if you're going to commercialize something, at least give me the thing that I might want, rather than than the thing that you're kind of forcing down my throat. And there are people who appreciate how the business operates and what the value of it can be.
I think other examples outside of that as well. You think of like maybe not as much this season, but Brighton, for example. I think their fans are always pretty acknowledge that is a well-run club, and people outside of that as well. You get your Brentfords also. So yeah, I think there is. I think fans are cognizant of the fact that there are good ways of doing things and there are bad ways of doing things, and sometimes that also sort of intensifies the bad a little bit, because if you are at a club like a Tottenham where you perceive that things aren't being run very well at the moment, and you look at a Brighton or a Brentford who are, in all terms smaller clubs but are punching higher than Spurs at the moment, that probably intensifies that anger a little bit, because you think, well, why can't we be like them? Why can't we do that when we've got all of this resource?
Well, I think it's sort of, it's a really good point, because it's sort of, you get to, in our bubble, Spurs are seen as one of the best run clubs in Europe. That story doesn't go down well when you go on a Spurs podcast, I assure you. I've tried it, and I don't recommend it.
We should look to bring this in. What's a story that kind of changed the way you think about the sports business, or encapsulated it in a way that maybe somebody outside it might be able to grasp? Or if you were to explain the sports business to somebody outside it, what's a story that you choose?
God, I don't know if this would be a good one to help explain the sports industry to someone outside of it, but I think the Be Out Q story was really interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because it was one of the first like big mag features that I wrote as well, and it was like back in 2018, and obviously spoke to BN about it, spoke to sort of various.
So this was just for people who aren't familiar, this was Saudi Arabia backing a piracy operation that basically stole wholesale beIN Sports feed and sold it to Saudi consumers as this thing Be Out Q, while there was this sort of diplomatic frost between Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
Exactly, yeah. And I think really interesting piece to work on, first of all, like speak to and just kind of all the various different factors at play, and then also just the way that kind of permeated the conversation for the years that followed, and it all came to a head with the public investment funds takeover of Newcastle. And I think that story in particular, just because of the various webs and the various different things that it touched, and you could almost sort of follow the way it unfolded on the day of that Newcastle takeover. I think news first started coming out that Be Out Q was ceasing or whatever, and then about half an hour later this takeover got announced, and you started to see the kind of various different forces at play. And I think for me that encapsulated the various influences that there are on the sports business, but also the way that sport is kind of while sport is kind of in control, that control is increasingly in the hands of other places now, and that influence is really spreading. And it sort of speaks to the conversation that we've been having throughout this, really, and just the way the industry is getting bigger, and the way that it's sort of changed over the past few years. And I don't know why, but that story in particular has stuck with me, partly because it was one of the first ones that I properly worked on, but also because it's kind of it was something that carried on for such a long time and came to a head in such an interesting way. And I think also that story, that Newcastle takeover, was one of those things that I think has made the sports business of more interest to a lot more people. I think that was quite a significant moment in that journey. So that's kind of the story that I'd point to, I think.
Yeah. Richard? I
think it's interesting. So piracy is a good one. There's some stories that just take off when they reach the mainstream, and piracy is one of them, because people are it's very conscious of, it gets to very quickly price, it gets to the sort of they're rip off Britain, my subscriptions, etc. All of that I think is really big territory. I think there's a whole similar with, like this week, the England shirt, 150 quid for the World Cup shirt. Those types of things are a sort of flag to go into, and you can start to tell some quite interesting stories off the back of them. But you do need stories at the, flags at the top to allow you, to give you permission to go in and go deeper. And people will follow you deeper if there is something interesting to start with. And I think there's it's the Man City thing. Suddenly everyone's a chartered accountant and wants to, have various views about that and Chelsea and those. So there's a bit there which, again, is a really useful device. And you do, back to the thing about having fans in the room, you do get a sense very quickly of, what makes people angry and what is just, just a here today, gone tomorrow news story. I've got a feeling because we come across these things earlier than the mainstream, the World Cup drinks break will be a big thing. The rugby ads in real time, play time, those types of stories are just ways into much deeper stuff that we talk about all the time. And sometimes you forget to get the flag out, and start to say, oh, hang on, one of the sort of common themes is, oh, hang on, no, I thought I wrote about this 6 months ago. I didn't realize it was that interesting. Then suddenly you think, oh yeah, well, no one was reading it then. So you got to dig that out and put it out again, which is part of the game.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, there's 3 questions that I ask everyone when they come on the podcast. The first one is, do you have an origin story or something that sparked your interest in sport?
It's probably quite similar to a lot of answers, but I really liked Leeds as a kid because they were on
That's
TV.
Not that similar to a lot of answers.
Well, they were on TV all the time and gravitated towards players like Harry Kewell and Viduka and that era, basically. And then slowly started to take an interest in Man United because my cousins are from up that way, and at that age just wanted to be like my cousins. Thankfully, my dad forced that out of me by tricking me to go to Selhurst Park when I was 4. He told me we were off to Old Trafford, and at that point I didn't really know how time worked, so I thought a half an hour drive from South London was enough to get us to Old Trafford, and then we slowly walked up and I could see Selhurst Park. So I think we lost 1-0 to Sheffield United. Marcus Bent scored, but I was kind of hooked ever since. So that's like the main part of it. But then I think also I spent 2 years in the US when I was quite young, so like 8 to 10. Lived just outside New York, and I think that's when I really started to take an interest in like all sport, basically, because it's just so ubiquitous over there with all the major leagues. College sport is just something on all the time, and I became a little bit fascinated by like US media as well and the way they covered sport, and still kind of am to an extent. Like really loved, like pretty sad, I really love Sports Center, and still one of the things I look forward to most whenever I go over there is just popping on the sports channels and kind of almost falling asleep to it, to be perfectly honest. So yeah, probably too much of a peek behind the curtain. Maybe that was a little bit Jake Humphrey of me as well. But yeah, that's kind of, those are the sort of like 2 things that I'd point to as what sort of really sparked my interest.
Yeah. Richard?
What's the story? Origin story. I sort of a child with a dream. No, so I grew up in sort of West London, and my dad and his family lived on White Hart Lane, so that was the Spurs connection. So that was always going to be a Tottenham. My dad played for Tottenham around the war, so that was the sort of, that's the root of that bit. And then you get to sort of the 70s Tottenham team were terrible, but you then get to the greatest year is Ozzy Ardiles and Ricky Villa arriving, Glenn Hoddle, that team of 1978. I always say that the day they signed Ozzy Ardiles, best day of my life, better than marriage, childbirth, all that nonsense. And then journalism, I got into it. I was a teacher. It was half term, and I thought, oh well, I would like to be a sort of sports journalist, So I went to what is now, I suppose, London. It was London College of Printing, LCP, but I can't remember what it is now. But it's somewhere up in town. And then I went in, and it was a master's in sports journalism. I didn't do it. I came out, and there was a little card on the wall saying, "Are you interested in cricket?" It was a Hotmail address, and they said, "Write a made-up sort of match report." So I did that and sent it off. Thought, oh, fuck it, I'll do it anyway. And then Channel 4 rang up 2 weeks later and said, "Can you be at Lord's on Thursday?" And that Thursday I went in, and it was when Channel 4 were doing cricket for the first time. And first person I met was David Gower. Second person was Richie Benno. So it was like and Mark Nicholas. So it was like a sort of really strange thing. I did that for a summer, and then it was a really stupid job. I was just sitting on email. It was like the early days of a sort of .com internet, the internet. And one of the jobs was supplying questions for Richie and Mark Nicholas to talk about at lunchtime. And because no one knew how to do, there was no question. So we had to make them up. So I remember making like questions up and putting them. And then there was one really good one about Chris Reed, who was a wicketkeeper. There was a perennial England wicketkeeper question, Alex Stewart or Chris Reed. And the question was, is it easier to turn Chris Reed into a good batsman or to turn Ian Bell into a wicketkeeper? Discuss. And Richie was he went on for about 45 minutes about this question and was thanking, and I'd put the name of my old mate in Hayes on there. And so, I want to thank Tony Gill very much. And Tony Gill was like sitting there watching, what the fuck, So anyway, that was my routine. And once you had Channel 4 on your CV, then it was quite easy to get another job.
Okay. What is your favourite piece of sports storytelling?
Damn United. Damn United is the book is brilliant. The film, I really like the film. I love Michael Sheen's sort of impression, but the book is fantastic. And this is me dropping it. I played golf. Because I was in Ireland for a few years. I played golf with Johnny Giles, who's in the book, and sued David Peace, the author, because he was quoted he didn't say any of the things that he was supposed to be, have said, which is a really odd situation. And Johnny Giles is obviously very, very angry, and but the book is fantastic. The book, if you haven't read it, I would go grab it.
Yeah,
it's fun. It is a brilliant book. Sam?
Yeah, I thought a lot about this. I was straight into the documentary space. I was going to give a bit of a shout out to Tour de France Unchained, not because it was like, and I know that one gets knocked quite a lot, but as you might know, Owen, I've been a bit of a cynic about cycling and never really got that into it, but that was one of the very few sports documentaries that I binged from start to finish, so I guess it kind of had its desired effect. But yeah, one of my favourite pieces of sports storytelling is Last Chance U, also Netflix documentary. I just think the way, and again, sort of maybe speaks a little bit to that background of growing up in the US and just that college sports space, which has always really fascinated me. And for those that haven't seen it, it's basically about, it sort of follows the story of these high school students playing American football, trying to make it to college. I think they do a basketball series as well, but all kind of emerging from kind of slightly troubled backgrounds and trying to make their path. And it's just really fascinating the way they do it, and really kind of challenging to watch at times as well, because and it sort of speaks a little bit as well, I guess, to that kind of academy system that we have over here as well, in the sense that there are just so many talented players that don't make it, and the reasons for that. And I think it really digs into that human side of those things as well. So yeah, really good documentary. I think there's sort of like 5 seasons of it as well, so if anyone hasn't watched that yet, would really encourage them to.
Okay. And finally, what's a sports story you'd like to tell or see somebody else tell?
This is very of the moment, this question, because and it came about, again, I mentioned Matt at the beginning, but we were at Matt's funeral, Matt Cutler's funeral last Friday, and it was obviously, incredibly emotional time. And then we were at the wake afterwards. I was talking to a few people, and the sort of conversation was, well, when are you going to tell these stories for real? Because everyone was telling anecdotes, and the anecdotes are fantastic. It talks about, we were saying earlier about just being in the bar and the sort of sense of the fun and interesting bits of being around the business of sport. And I was listening to some people, and they're, telling war stories, but they've been in rooms, they've been in places that are really where decisions are made, and how it's more like the thick of it than, people want to sort of let on. It's always, fantastically stupid incompetence, at a very high level. I love all that type of thing. And so I think my message is just write the fucking things down. We were just, we were at a bloke who's 39 who's died, and if you're not going to do it, when you're going to do it? That was the sort of part of the conversation. And so there's loads of stories to be written, and people are just carrying them around in their heads, holding on to them for one final day that they'll, finally get round to it. Don't do that. Just write it down and just get it out. Do a Substack, do it on a podcast, whatever it is, but just I think it's quite cathartic to be able to do it. Yeah.
Well said. Sam?
I don't know if I can follow that one, to be honest. I think if you'd asked me this a year ago, I probably would have said I wanted someone to tell the sports story of Palace winning a major trophy, but they went and took that one away from me. I think it's quite a simple one, really. Like, having covered the Olympics on the ground for the first time in Paris, I think I've just got an appetite to tell stories like that more and be at those major events and major occasions as much as I possibly can, and make the most of being in a role like this while I'm in it. So the next one being the World Cup, spending a bit of time over in Vancouver for that one. But I think just generally the stories around this World Cup are going to be fascinating, kind of unlike any other that we've seen in the past. So that's a story that I would like to tell, and I'm sure that lots of other people will be telling as well. So that's the one I point to.
Yeah, but embrace it, I think, is the message from both of you. Guys, it's been a lot of fun. SportsPro London, 29th and 30th of April?
Correct, yes.
There you go.
Hopefully see you both there.
At the Kia Oval. So yeah, do check that out if you're of a mind to. But yeah, thanks very much, Sam and Richard.
Thank you very much, Owen, for your how do we call your role? Yeah, the way in which you've steered this ship.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Cheers, chaps. Enjoyed it.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Outlines is an original production from 2640.